She has done TED Talks. So without further ado, Natalie, please come up and tell us about it.
I think I've got a Madonna headset on, so you can, I just gave away my age, right, if I think Madonna's still cool. In 2015, I was contacted by TEDx Cleveland, which is the Cleveland version of TED International, to talk about the untold stories in Cleveland, specifically the untold stories of families in crisis. Who are they? How did they get there? And what traps them there? But TEDx Cle needed more than just their stories. TED International challenged Cleveland's position as an institutional leader in higher education, research, healthcare, and wanted the facts. They wanted research to prove that these stories were true. So as I worked on my TED Talk, the stories came really easily. I could tell you thousands of stories about the children and families whose lives we've changed in my 17 years at Providence House. But sadly, the data came really easily too. For the thousands of stories that I could tell you about our families and children, there are thousands of research studies that continue to reinforce the terrible outcomes for people who live in poverty and crisis. So I got a call from Peter Schindler and David Dombrowiak to invite me to lunch. My TED Talk apparently caught David's attention, and he shared it with the board and shared it at the poverty simulation. And as they were thinking about this meeting today, they thought, why don't we bring someone from our own front line in to talk about what poverty is, what we see in this community, nationally and locally, what is happening to families and children, particularly given the work that we do. Like Providence House, Community West is an outcomes-focused learning organization. They want to learn together, teach others, and challenge themselves to understand the real issues facing our community. I want to applaud the Community West leadership and staff and their board for taking such time and care to learn about the root causes that the issues that our communities are facing, and that you've trusted me, and is such an honor to share this knowledge with this amazing group of people here today, donors, partners, and friends. As I talk to you today, I hope I didn't advance my slide. As I talk to you today, I hope that you'll experience three things. That you'll be moved by the stories that you're going to hear about the children and families in our community who are suffering through poverty. That you will be maddened and furious about how much we know about them and the traps that hold them back that aren't changing. And that you will be motivated to take action, to learn more, to volunteer, and to advocate for change so that this stops. So, why am I here? What does Providence House know about being trapped in poverty? Most people think we just take care of babies and kids. We're rocking babies all day. But I want to tell you a little bit more about Providence House and who we really serve and why. And like so many of our human services partners that are here today who we work with day in and day out, we have a front row seat to the tragedy that is poverty in our community. So Providence House is Ohio's first licensed crisis nursery. Our second nursery is here, Blessing House from Lorain County. Go ladies. Joining us today, we're a 30-bed crisis nursery. We have a crisis nursery, a pediatric crisis nursery, and a family center. We were founded in 1981, and we have served over 8,000 children in crisis since our doors opened. We are accredited, we're licensed, we're certified CARF, we're Medicaid certified, behavioral health certified. We believe that the work that we do is critical for our families, and we want to be the best in class in the work that we do to serve them well. Our vision is that children everywhere are raised in safe, loving homes, free from abuse and neglect. And our mission is to protect at-risk children, support families through crisis, and strengthen our communities to prevent child abuse and neglect. And our message, as you heard from David, is keep kids safe and families together. They don't need to be split apart to resolve crisis. I want to tell you a little bit about kind of the growth we've seen in inquiries, and this is true for most of our human services partners. Need is rising, and it's rising quickly. We have seen a 170% increase in calls for people inquiring about admitting their children to our crisis nursery in just the past 5 years. The admissions that we see similarly, 65% increase in the number of children that we're serving, 75% increase in the parent engagement of the children that are with us, which is critically important. And even with this, I want to highlight that in the last few years, between 150 and 170 children are still not getting in our nursery. They are unserved. Last year, nearly 70% of those children came from the Buckeye, Kinsman, Huff area, one of the most distressed communities in our city, and they can't get to us. So stay tuned for some news about that and how Providence House is going to help them. I think probably the biggest testament to the confidence that families have in us and the trust that they have in us is that 67% of the families who come to Providence House self-refer. We are the first door they knock on. They hear from other families who've used our services. They're not trying to take your children away. They're trying to help you get back on your feet and keep your family together. These are some statistics about the children, the reason that children have come to us, but I want to highlight for you that 75% of our families are coming to us because they are homeless and living in unsafe housing and or are unable to meet the most basic needs of their children: food, utilities, shelter. 75% of the families that we see. I want to share a little bit. Oh, did I pass up? I passed up the poverty slide, which is the most important slide today. 96% of our families are living in poverty. 67% of them, deep poverty. We have families living on less than $2 a day and families who have had no cash income for a month or more prior to even coming to Providence House. I want to highlight a little bit about the race and ethnicity of the children that we serve, and I'm going to bring up a gender slide. And the reason I'm going to do that is when I get into some of the statistics around particularly our Black African American families and the structural racism that we have embedded into our systems to continue to perpetuate their lives in poverty. And while we're going to give some universal statistics, I really want you to understand that it's the majority of the population that we see. These are our families in poverty that are coming to Providence House. They are also predominantly female head of households, almost exclusively, as you can see by the large blue pie that represents our parents. So in 2001, a program officer at a different foundation, sorry, David, told me something that I've never forgotten. She said, "Poverty is a state of the pocketbook. It is not a state of mind." There's always this assumption that poor people are stupid and lazy, that they don't love their children, that parenting poor means they're poor parents. When I gave my TED Talk, and it was filled with all the research and data you're going to see, not quite as much as we have here today because I have a little more time, so it'll be leaking out your ears by the time I'm done. A staff member of ours in the audience heard a person behind her say, "This is all propaganda. These families don't really want to get better." As recently as a month ago, we had one of our donors anonymously return one of our mailings that featured a homeless mom covered in violent handwriting and a black pen saying she should just keep her legs closed, she should just keep her legs shut and not have any more kids. They had no idea that that mom of 7 kids had fled another county from domestic violence and had nowhere to take her children. And they spouted that hatred. And while I said that poverty is not a state of mind, I want you to think about this. Research shows that poverty has a mental health impact akin to losing 13 IQ points from the mental anguish of just trying to survive. And the US isn't doing so great. So we've got a lot of working poor in our community. Many of you have heard the term. You think the story is easy. A lot of people think the story is easy, get a better job, earn more money. But being working poor isn't just being hungry and broke. It's a mathematical equation that a lot of our human service partners know and try to understand based on federal income guidelines and the number of people in a household. Most poor people don't even get it, let alone how to get out of it. And so it's amazing to me still that in the most developed countries in the world, the largest population of people living in poverty are children. The US now ranks, this is a more recent UNICEF study, the US now ranks in the 5th lowest globally, only above places like Romania, Bulgaria, and Mexico, for the number of children who live in poverty. And we know from census data that more than half of the Clevelanders living in poverty are women with children. And 44% of those children will remain there for the rest of their lives. And it's much worse for our Black families. They really get stuck there, particularly the children. It's a trend that's called the sticky ends. The top 5% of the wealthy and the bottom percent of poverty never get out. As we keep our eye out for data about the new faces of poverty, I want to highlight we're starting to see some pretty good research about refugees and the LGBT community, and they're quickly being documented among the ranks of our poorest citizens. And that is emerging data that we all need to be paying attention to because the landscape of our poor is changing. So we always get asked, why do people get stuck in poverty? So one of the biggest reasons is what we call the benefits cliff, big old hairy slide here. And I'm gonna send this deck to Community West that they can put on a website or distribution. You can dig into this stuff or call us for information. And the benefits cliff really is about the US overall lags so far behind most developed countries in programs for women with children and for working poor. US women with children and working poor can receive benefits, as many of us know, for food and daycare and rental assistance, health care, things that help them keep their heads above water even though they're not earning a living wage. But they can't earn too much. So let me point out, when we look at this, there's the black box sort of in the middle is the $15 an hour minimum wage. This is the big minimum wage increase that everybody was abuzz about. You know, City of Cleveland wanted legislation, Ohio wanted legislation. We fought it, and we took a lot of heat for that. And the reason we fought it is, notice the steep drop that happens on all those benefit lines as soon as somebody earned $15 an hour. So we'll pay them a little more, but we'll cut their legs out from under them and take away all their benefits so they can't afford to pay for anything that they need for their children, for their house, for their food, for their rent. And they're actually poorer, making more money than if we left them alone. We actually have a father, this is a true story, at Providence House, who has turned down 7 promotions at work to remain qualified for Medicaid because he cannot close the financial gap to pay for health care for his chronically ill son. He loves his son so much that he is holding himself back professionally so that he can retain the benefits that are the only thing keeping his son healthy. True story. So how much money is too much money? So I'm going to bring up a quick slide. I'm going to talk about Tunisia and Sandra. So Tunisia she was already working poor. We had worked with Tunisia. She got back on her feet. She was getting assistance. She worked for a cleaning service. She had 2 little girls. So she was making about $20,000 a year for a family of 3, and she did qualify for a lot of the assistance that I've been talking about. It was keeping her family afloat. Things were tight, but she was making it. She was doing okay. Then she got a raise. She started earning $12 an hour, not even $15 an hour, almost $25,000 a year. And we're all saying, yay, right, good for her. She's not doing better. Her pay increase disqualified her for virtually all of those benefits. The things that were keeping her family afloat. She had no way to pay out of pocket for everything, and she was actually now taking home less money after trying to pay than when she was working poor. Ultimately, she got fired from her job because she was missing work, because she lost her child care vouchers and couldn't go to work. She had to stay home with her girls. Her unemployment then, she couldn't pay the rent, which led to eviction. And her family, like so many families that we in this sector of work, spiraled into homelessness, hunger, and even deeper poverty, and she had to start all over again. It's so frustrating to see this cycle perpetuated by the very systems that were created to lift people out of poverty. Sandra, who had 4 children and was an STNA, experienced the same. Got a pay increase, disqualified, and what the arrows are showing you is the 40,000 for Tunisia and the 56,000 for Sandra. It would be what they would need to earn just to make it, to cover those expenses that I just talked about in food, in childcare, in rent. To make a living wage, to have a savings account, deal with a financial crisis, have any extra income to take a vacation or do anything special for their children, the leap is so high, and the jobs aren't available, and the job training isn't available to necessarily get them into the qualified jobs that pay at this rate. Probably not many of you in the audience are being paid at this rate. I want to point out, I talked about childcare. This is kind of a hard to see slide, so we'll get this to you, but this is one of our biggest frustrations. So childcare vouchers are very similar problem for working for poor families. You don't just get a childcare voucher so you can get a job. You have to have a job and have pay stubs to prove you have a job to qualify for your vouchers, typically 4 pay stubs, at least a month of pay, sometimes more. But who watches your kids while you go to work to get the pay stub to earn the voucher? A few years ago, a number of years ago, I don't know if you remember a news story, a toddler fell out of a window in a CMHA unit. He was bouncing on the bed, fell through the screen, fell to the ground. He was alone in his apartment because his mother's employer had threatened that if she missed one more day of work, she would be fired, and she was 1 pay stub away from her child care vouchers, and her boyfriend didn't show up to babysit. So she left for work, and her baby died. And even what can look like positive reduction in system benefits, thanks to our friends at Community Shares, I just got this a couple days ago, benefits reliance reduction can be reported. The sad fact, though, is this is the Ohio Works First results, and they're showing this declining reliance on benefits for families in Ohio. The assumption is these families have returned to work, they're earning enough money, they don't need the benefits. In actuality, most of these declining numbers are families who timed out of the program. They ran out of time, they lose the benefits anyway, and so they don't report that most of this decline are families timed out of their program, and Ohio no longer tracks the families once they drop out of the program, even if they're just qualified for time limits. They just think they moved on. So it's easy to assume that moms living in poverty, kids growing up in crisis, are these really bad parents who've made really bad choices, and it really could be further from the truth. These are women and children and men, I'm not leaving men out, who've been really victimized and marginalized their entire lives, and now they're trying to raise kids on their own. And we're helping these families. We're pulling them from the brink. We're trying to break multi-generational cycles and traps of poverty and abuse and violence. And we're trying to address public policies that are perpetuating poverty. We have families that are, in all of our services see this, we have families that we see these generational cycles. We know that families that have experienced system involvement, typically it's the children are system involved, the parent was system involved, the grandparent was system involved. We can talk about fourth and fifth generation system involved parents. We work with parents that have been exposed to trauma for their entire lives and now are bringing that trauma into their own parenting, which can make it very difficult not only to survive as an adult, but to be an amazing parent. So it's always easy for people to say to us when we talk about the impact of poverty and trauma and violence and neglect on children that they're so little, they'll forget. They won't remember that, but their brains and bodies don't forget. And it's important that we remember that. New research in what's called epigenetics and generational trauma is really looking at the fact that there are genetic connections to trauma through generations of families. And in fact, there are some interesting studies going on right now tracking genetic issues, including mental health disorders, chronic adult health disease, substance abuse, predilection for substance abuse, tracking families from the Holocaust to current generations, tracking survivors at 911 through their children. We know that this has an impact, and those are specific incidents. Think about if your mother and you and your children, day after day after day, have this trauma. So we know that what they call toxic stress that comes from trauma, particularly they tie it with children, will stay with them through the rest of their lives. UNICEF has looked at this from child well-being. Kaiser's ACEs studies. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. The more of them you have, the more likely you are to have really negative outcomes throughout your life. So when you pull all of this together, and this is a sample of some of the ACEs, someone in your house had a substance abuse, your mother was treated violently, your parents divorced. People with 6 or more of these ACEs will die 20 years earlier than someone who doesn't have them because of things in their lifestyle, things in their genes that have changed and morphed and made them more vulnerable. Every year, Providence House screens about a little over 300 children, about 350 children, and over 200 parents for their exposure to trauma and violence before they get to Providence House. It's scary what we see. Half of our children and parents are victims or witnesses of crime and violent trauma. Across the U.S. and in Cuyahoga County, it is estimated that 60% of all children under 18 years of age will be a witness or victim to violence or trauma. We know a lot about these kids. We know that they will have lower IQs. They're more likely to drop out of high school. They're violent youths. They're more likely to use drugs and alcohol, be teen parents. They have mental health disorders. As adults, they're more likely to be unemployed and homeless. They are more likely to abuse their own children. And as I mentioned, they're more likely to die earlier than their nurtured peers due to heart disease, cancer, and other chronic illness. So, we talked about kids in crisis. Let's talk about sort of where are we at now for as a community, as a nation, in infant mortality. And poverty is a big factor in the infant mortality rates that we're seeing across the United States. In fact, the US, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, ranks 4th worst in infant mortality in developed countries. We are one of the richest, most developed countries in the world, and our babies are dying at the fastest rate across the globe. We're also, Ohio is 7th worst in the country, and Cleveland's rates are 3 times worse than the rest of the country. In fact, we are seeing 6 black babies die for every 1 white baby in this community. And our friends at First Year are working on this issue. We're seeing improvements in our white families, but our black families continue to see this horrific death and morbidity in their infant population. And for the kids that do survive, 3 million children in the United States are investigated for suspected abuse or neglect on an annual basis. 800,000 of them are victims. It's proven and it's substantiated. I'm going to share what probably one of the most startling statistics. It's still accurate, but it's still, we are seeing about 3 million of these kids, and within those 800,000, in addition to those, about 2,000 a year are killed annually. Most of them are under the age of 2. So I'm going to set this up a different way. In the first 10 years of the Afghanistan war, 2,000 American military lost their lives. In the same 10 years, 20,000 U.S. children were killed in their homes on American soil by a member of their family. I hope you're as horrified by this as I am. And I want to know, where's their wall, and why aren't we talking about this? So you saw the impact that poverty and crisis had on Michael in our video relative to education. Lower IQ, limited vocabulary, learning challenges, persistently poor children. These are children who grew up in poverty for most of their lives, if not all, fare so far worse than their never poor peers. 62% of our poor children will never finish high school. And we see this story at Providence House in our school-age children. We now go up to the age of 12. So we're seeing children that are misdiagnosed with behavioral disorders because they are so traumatized. They're truant from school because they're home parenting younger children in the family because mom's mental health or addiction or other issues is preventing them from going to school. We're advocating for these children, trying to get them in the right education plan, on the right track at school, going to school, and getting their younger brothers and sisters enrolled in quality UPK preschool programs. It is absolutely essential so that we stop seeing this kind of a statistic. And over 1 million U.S. children, students, are homeless. They're on the registers, 1.4 something, registered school-age children register as homeless in their school districts. In Cleveland Public Schools last year, nearly 3,000 children registered as homeless in the Cleveland Public School system alone. I bring up another emerging risk population that we're not really paying attention to that much. New research coming out, 120% higher risk for LGBT youth to be homeless. They are now the largest growing homeless population in the United States. Nearly 60% of homeless families nationally have children under the age of 18. And there's been a 24% increase just in Cuyahoga County since 2015 in homeless families with children. And housing isn't easy to find. I was just talking to a couple of our partners about when we get homeless families, They either burn through all the options that we've got in our shelter community. Rapid rehousing is a one and done. You only can get rent subsidy for so long. You fail it once, you're done. So families are waiting in line for years for public housing. It's extending the times their children are staying in emergency shelters like ours or in shelters across our city. It is a real problem. 1 in 4 of our poor renting families is paying over 70% of their income just in rent and utilities. How much does that leave for food and clothing and school supplies for their kids and all the other things that we all have and need to survive? And our housing stock is sick. So even if they find houses, our kids are getting sick while their little brains are developing. We are 4 times above the national average in the number of kids who have lead poisoning from the sick houses they live in. So why don't parents complain? Why don't they say to their landlord, I'm taking you to court, I'm getting out of here, I'm reporting you? This is why. They don't stand a chance out there. They complain, they get booted. So they don't say anything. And the problem here is 24 families in Cleveland are being evicted a day. That's criminal. And they get evicted because they reported their landlord for pests in the apartment or mold, unsafe conditions like bullet holes and broken locks on their doors, lead, or through no fault of their own, the landlord stops paying the water bill and they turn the water off and they have no water for their kids in the house. Happens all the time. We had a Providence House mom that came to us because her housing was not safe. Her landlord would not fix the broken lock on her apartment door that had been broken into repeatedly. There were bullets flying through her windows. She had 2 little boys. She was so scared for her little boys in that setting. She brought them to us, and then we helped connect her to some of our tenant advocate organizations and housing organizations trying to resolve this issue, and she knew her kids were safe. Her level of crisis and fear was so high that she was so focused on living in this unsafe house that when she came to us, imagine our shock when we realized that her 8-year-old son had autism and her 4-year-old son had cerebral palsy, and his wheelchair and braces had gotten stolen in one of the break-ins. She didn't even have the equipment for him. So not only were we trying to deal with the community violence situation and the unsafe housing situation, she was so focused on keeping her kids safe that they weren't connected to their managed care coordination. They weren't connected to their health home. They weren't getting the therapies and the medicines and the equipment that they needed. And we had to navigate her back into those systems because her number one priority was that her kids didn't get killed when her landlord wouldn't deal with her housing problem. And evicted doesn't just mean you're homeless. Mental health issues crop up, depression, suicides have been documented tied to eviction and mental health disorders. We know that suicide rates overall have been climbing across the nation. They're linked to opioids, financial pressures. We're seeing increase in white middle-aged men. Cyberbullying is coming after the teenagers. Suicide rates for moms who lose their kids to custody and foster care are 4 times higher than moms who raise their kids. That's in addition to astronomical increases in mental health issues like depression and substance abuse. And our younger generation, there was just recently a survey done. My own kids are in the Rocky River City Schools, Pam, woo, Pirates. And they participate in this. 1 in 6 kids in Cuyahoga County, teens in our high school system, have reported that they have considered suicide in the past year. Frightening. And it's even worse for our LGBT youth. We know the opioid epidemic definitely is playing a part in this. It's not the whole factor, but I want to kind of give you a sense of that. It's a growing trend in death by suicide. We are the top of the heap for unintentional overdoses right here in Ohio, Cuyahoga County, right at the top. And the problem with this isn't just the death rates, it's flooding our foster care system, leaving kids behind when entire family systems are addicts. Not just mom and dad, but grandma and aunt and cousin and brother. These kids have nowhere to go. And we are seeing it pound the foster care system nationally. We have kids in Cuyahoga County right now that are being sent to counties 3 hours away because there are no foster homes for them in Cuyahoga County. There's nowhere for them to go. We have kids in southern Ohio being placed out of state because there's nowhere for them to go. And it's an expensive spend. $45 million is being spent in Ohio on these kiddos tied to the opioid crisis. And I want to highlight, we keep talking about the opioid crisis, and I don't have a slide on this. Look up meth storm, because that's the next wave. This is going to get taken care of. This is going to go away. Because we're already seeing some reduction, but meth is sweeping in right behind it. It's cheap. The opioid inhibitor blockers that they're giving to a lot of addicts don't work on meth, and Border Patrol is seeing triple the amount of methamphetamine moving across the line. So that's going to be our next drug and epidemic to monitor. Hate to tell you. So beyond the fact that you feel empathy for these kids and families and their human suffering and women and children, why should you care, and why, more importantly, should our taxpayers care and our governments care? Because this is really expensive stuff. So you can see here in the US, we spend over $80 billion in costs around child abuse and neglect. And neglect is deeply seated in poverty, lack of basic needs, hunger, shelter. In Ohio, we're at $4 billion. And that's not including some of the escalating foster care costs that we're seeing around the opioid. Last year, Ohio tends to trend around 30,000 to 35,000 kids who get substantiated, so victims of maltreatment, abuse, or neglect every year. We will spend in lifetime costs for those kids through foster care, incarceration, mental health disorders, Medicaid underwriting, all of that. We're going to spend over $200,000 a kid. So that's $600 million for just last year's kids. And guess what? We're going to have just as many or more this year. And they just keep coming. We have to stop this from happening. The cost is too high. So we know all this data about women and children in poverty, the impact of violence and trauma, the incredible costs in human and social, economic capital. Why are we not getting better? Like, if we know all this, why aren't we fixing it? Or why can't we fix it if we wanted to? So if their lives are so bad, why aren't they doing something? More importantly, why aren't we doing something? And we're going to get to that. Most of our families, like many of the families that many of our providers and partners in the room deal with, are terrified to ask for help because they feel like if they hit the radar and they say, I need to go into an inpatient psych program, I need to go into an inpatient drug treatment program, I've got a medical disorder that's going to require me to be hospitalized, but I've got 3 little kids. They don't want their kids taken away. Their number one fear, and the first question we get asked when a parent calls Providence House is, you won't take my kids away, right? So in a sense, their love for their children keeps them a little bit trapped, and they need to know it's safe, that we're all here to help them, that we're not here, we're all mandated reporters. We're gonna call if we suspect it. They fear you're just gonna call because you're gonna call, because they ask for help and they have kids, and you're gonna judge them as a bad parent unable to care for their kids because they have an addiction or a mental health disorder. So at Providence House, we're so blessed and fortunate. For the last 10 years plus running, we have preserved 98% of our families. And no children have entered the foster care system out of our program since June of 2017. They're going home with their mommies and their daddies, and they're being raised with their families that have been stabilized and strengthened, and we're returning healthy families to our communities. This result, just at Providence House, represents $8 to $9 million in Cuyahoga County that we're not paying for foster care because we gave these families a chance. We believed that they could move through crisis, that they could battle through poverty, that they could be self-sufficient and resilient. We have to begin to challenge the policies and the perceptions and the prejudices about families in poverty in our community. Because if we believe they are not worthy, if we believe it cannot be stopped, if we believe they can't turn their lives around, then the poverty is in our mind, not theirs. We know we can change these stories. We change these families' stories every day. You saw the Michael and Tasha video. Every intervention at any earlier the better. That doesn't mean we don't give our moms and dads intervention at 25 and 35 and 40. Every intervention at every age, everything we can do to give a moment of nurturing, a moment of compassion, a moment of hope goes so far in erasing that history of trauma and moving our families forward, believing that they can be successful. We have been really fortunate at Providence House. As I mentioned, we're a learning outcomes-focused organization. We invite evaluation because, gosh, we want to know if it's not working. We better know that too, and we hope it's working. So we've worked with Case Western Reserve University on a number of assessments. An earlier study that was published nationally proved to us that we know 82% of the kids that we serve at Providence House don't enter the foster care system. And that study was a couple years ago. Now we've got real-time data saying now not even any of them currently. That doesn't mean foster care is not bad. If there's nowhere else for them to go, that's the safest place. We recently did an evaluation, though, about well-being outcomes for families, which can be so challenging for all of us to track. How do you know you moved a family out of poverty or they're on a trajectory to self-sufficiency? It's really hard for a lot of us to do that, and we were really fortunate that the Gun Center at Case included us in a research pilot that they did. And I want to just show you a couple highlights, and then we're going to wrap up real quickly here. We saw with our families a 33% increase in their monthly income after they came to Providence House. Now, we didn't give them a job, but last year we made or received referrals with 123 community partner organizations to get that result, to get this work done. Housing, employment, childcare, you name it. We have amazing partners, an amazing network in this community, and we do collaborate and work together. This is the result of that. A 33% increase in income in a year, pretty amazing. Employment, almost 74% increase in employment for our families. Housing, 16%, and that's even with all the housing challenges in our community. Enrollment in daycare or school. Huge challenge and one of the most important starts for our children to work their way out of poverty, to learn their way out of poverty. So now I'm going to talk about a dirty word, and we're going to finish up. Lobbying, advocacy, government relations. If you're a nonprofit who thinks you do not have to be doing advocacy work, you're crazy. The only voice your client has is you. Public policy, and I've seen it over and over again, gets decided around the voice that's heard the most, the information they have. The worst thing that we can do for marginalized communities is to remain ignorant of research and not inform ourselves and not share our information with the public sector. Lobbying is not a dirty word. We're allowed to do it. Check the IRS regulations. There are limits. There are some things you can't do. Don't start endorsing candidates and all that good stuff. But it is absolutely essential that you are giving voice and advocating for your clients' needs, that you are educating policymakers about bad policy, about policies like what happens when you raise the minimum wage to $15 and literally tens of thousands of women and children can't survive without a correlating conversation. We do have a job to advocate for policies. We do have a job to secure investment in capital and operational needs to serve more people who need us. As public agencies, and I'm not gonna, talk about levy dollars and all that good stuff, but as public agencies are reducing their investments in social concerns and human services. We all know it, we're all seeing it. Contracts are getting cut, reimbursements are getting cut, and the burden is falling to nonprofits, private donors, and foundations like Community West to carry this burden, to pay for our programs that are doing better, more effectively, more efficiently, at a lower cost, good investments. And we deserve to say, you need to invest in us. State, federal, local, be afraid. We took on their jobs, and we're doing a great job at it. So if you're not doing advocacy, you should be. And if you complain, if you come up to me and you complain that you don't have funding from this resource, or this policy decision is terrible, or this legislation is going to pass that's going to devastate your agency, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, who did you talk to at the local, state, or federal level about it? Because if they don't know, they're making a decision in a vacuum. No legislature wants to pass bad policy. But if they don't have all the information, they're going to pass the policy they think is the best policy. Providence House has been doing advocacy for nearly 10 years now. We've improved licensing standards, we've received funding, we've been able to grow our campus with private-public partnerships. It's important for the health of our nonprofit sector that the public sector gets used to us educating them and asking them for help. Our work is really important. It's too important to our community, to our families and children. And I know that this is not necessarily a comfortable place for people, but it is a place that you need to be. So I hope I achieve my promise to move you, to madden you, and to motivate you to take action and help change the stories of poverty in our community. I'm going to close with a quote from a Dr. Seuss story, a little bedtime story. See, I am a crisis nursery lady. A little bedtime story for the end of your business day. It's from the Lorax. You probably know it. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So let's make it better. Thank you.